dragging things lightly before I say something serious. One is I was the original dropout of Stanford University, and I opposed United States invasion of Europe then as I oppose the invasion of Vietnam today. I think they're not disconnected. I think when I was at that age of being a student, everyone said, why didn't people resist Stalin's Russia? Why didn't they resist Mussolini's Italy? Why didn't they resist Hitler's Germany? Every good American, assuming, of course, I will resist myself if tyranny becomes here. Well, tyranny was already there. I mean, it's here now, and it's clearer. But I think the resistance has to become more widespread. I mean, it's very nice to ask other people to resist, but I think that it's you and I who really have to resist. And I think those of us who are too old for the draft, and those of us who are young ladies, there are real things that we can do. And I think it's very important that we do. I think we can't go on saying, business as usual. And there's one hopeful thing, say, in 1968. It's nice to be able to say there's one hopeful thing in 1968. More is known about nonviolent resistance than, say, 1932. But here was a funny man in Asia named Gandhi who was not only resisting the British Empire, but developing a constructive program at the same time. And I think it's not as dramatic to construct real programs to replace, institutions like UCLA, or Stanford. But I think that's the sort of thing we really have to do. We have to make a whole new kind of institutional as well as psychological and human life if we're really to go on. And I think I'll close by saying that, of course, there has to be a revolution. And that revolution really means that no life can be dedicated to a cause, and that cause is superior to that life. I think the real revolution is that the life really takes precedence over any kind of cause we may have, even the cause of nonviolence. Thank you.
I think in order for us to understand how we can keep getting up in the morning and going to school and eating breakfast and going on dates while the world is in such agony, we have to understand something. I think in order for us to look at those pictures that circulate now and then of Vietnamese children and of all the other war children who are left in scars, and we look at it and we go, ugh, and then we forget it because we're shock resistant. I think if we look at it this way, that we've been raised since birth or even pre-birth to be schizophrenics. I think we've been told, on the one hand, by our mothers and fathers and Sunday school teachers and synagogue preachers and school teachers and so forth, that it's nice to be nice and one should love one another and your neighbor and even yourself and even your parents. Be kind to small animals and birds. And what happens is, in one way we grow up this way and we're good Joes and we try to be decent. But unfortunately, the other half of the split personality is tribalism. For the most part, it's whatever nation you live in that takes the other half of your personality. Unfortunately, for most of us, say most clearly when you're an 18-year-old boy in this country, it gets about 100% of your personality. And why we have to be tribalistic, or why it is we can't rely upon ourselves, I don't really know. My guess would be that it's been easier since the beginning of time to group together. One of the reasons is that maybe you'll never have to face yourself, and maybe you'll never really have to make your own decision ever, ever, ever. And I would think that would be one reason why we would group off. About a year ago, I was going around saying that if we ever wanted to realize anything like the brotherhood of man, then we'd have to break down the nation state, and there were 123 nation states. Well, now there are 130 of them, so I've been a smashing success the way I planned. But I still say the same thing. I think that what divides us in half is the big daddy that steps in and says that in this case it's okay to kill. In this case it's okay to wear a uniform, it's okay to kill. Inside the nation state it's not okay. Depending on where you live and what color person you kill, you can get by pulling strings now and then, but for the most part it's frowned upon inside your own country to kill somebody. And then the minute you step over the right border in the right season and you see somebody in the right uniform, you get a medal for doing what you could have gone to jail or gotten death for within your own country. So how do you begin to break it down? If you're serious about talking about a brotherhood of man, then you begin to understand what I mean by breaking down nation state. And that is, if you were serious about brotherhood of man, then you would think of every single human being on earth, and there are 3 billion of them, as your brother and your sister. And then you would know that you had no right, no matter what the name of the latest slaughter was, you had no right to take the life of any member of that family. If you could really seriously understand what it meant, if you could think for a minute of the person that you have a crush on, or the person you're infatuated with, or the person that you really dig, or the person you're married to, and think that every other life on earth is that meaningful to you, then you would begin to understand what brotherhood of man means. And then you'd also understand what is so hard about it, that we really are shock resistant because of that schizophrenia thing. And then about nonviolence, in the school in Carmel Valley I set up a few years ago really was mainly for myself. I was tired of being a political nincompoop. No, I was tired of being sort of good-hearted and having naive ideas and intentions. But I also had the feeling that nonviolence was the only intelligent way to act, both on personal level, social level, and political level. So I asked Ira Sandpearl, who had made sense to me for the last 10 years in speaking about Gandhi and nonviolence, to come and run the school. Nonviolence is no more than a political word for love. Unfortunately for us, we have one example, one really good example in the history of man. Unfortunately for us, though Gandhi had lots of flaws, nonviolence in an organized fashion and as resistance is very, very young, whereas violence, as you know, we have since the beginning of time. I think probably the nonviolent man existed since the beginning of time also. There was probably a caveman who refused to carry a club, and everybody said, oh, you're nuts, you're going to get your head knocked in. And he probably did. But then I think that nonviolence was never really organized on any mass scale until Gandhi. And in spite of all Gandhi's flaws, there was a real beginning, because there was a man who said, look, there are two sides to human nature. There's a stupid one, there's a visceral one, there's also a decent one. Why the hell don't we organize a decent side of human nature for a change? So he took on a job that was really much harder, and he accomplished some things, and I think there were some things that we really have to finish. I think for us, in this decade, nonviolence is almost totally 100% misunderstood. I think for the most part, though I knew King and I loved King, our relationship over the last 3 years before he was killed consisted of an argument, and I would ask him what the hell he meant by nonviolence, because I had a terrible feeling that what nonviolence meant in civil rights movement was don't slug anybody while the cameras are rolling on you. And he kept saying we have to get the black keys and the white keys of the piano in tune, and I kept saying the whole damn orchestra is shot. We have to start with something much, much deeper and much farther reaching. And also, of course, King was a good American, and I don't think that being a good American, can coexist with being a civilized human being very easily. King was a good man. So, nonviolence means to me that I'm a fighter. I think what it might mean if any of you decided to take the commitment to be a nonviolent soldier would mean that you might learn how to fight for the first time in your lives. Nonviolence means you get up off your ass, not that you sit down on it, as is often connoted with the word nonviolence. It means that as a nonviolent soldier, I have not a weapon which has done nothing but bring more weaponry. I have not to resort to violence, which has done nothing from the beginning of time but bring on more violence. But I have my mind, such as it is, my sense of humor, my imagination, my soul, and the understanding that everybody else on earth is sacred. And with this, I go to war, and I go to war against violence. And my appeal to you is that in trying to understand brotherhood of man, that you relate to each other, your quote superiors, your quote inferiors, as brothers. And that way you would begin to understand that you have your own mind and you have your own decisions to make. And for God's sake, begin to understand that other people need you and that you can do your little part, which may be the only possibility we have for realizing the brotherhood of man. Thank you.
I'd like to begin with an assumption. And that assumption has to do with what it is that you and I possess as a tool. What is it that each of us has that enables us to bring things to be in this world? What is it that we can build with? And the assumption I want to begin with is the tool we possess is something far beyond a political rhetoric, far beyond an ideology, far beyond a candidate, or far beyond a slogan. What you and I have that's our real tool is a life. And what matters as we try and begin to build things in the world is how that life is lived from day to day to day. And I think as we try and understand the process of the building of a society and try and understand the process of history, what we can see there is not a series of great men or a series of events. What you can see are those basic choices that the people day to day on the streets made. What you can see is that life that people decided to live, not on the grand scale on the top of the social ladder, but on the bottom also. And what that history is really a set of terms that people accepted and lived their lives within. And I think the fact that you and I face in modern America today is not simply that a politician has made the wrong policy, or not simply that the wrong person has been elected to the wrong office. The fact that you and I have to face is that whole basic set of assumptions that American society rests upon, that whole logic, that whole bottom social construction has come into direct conflict with any meaningful notion of humanity. And that what's at stake is not simply policies, but the meaning of a whole society and a whole civilization. And the meaning that the civilization that you and I are a part of has come to take in the world is the simple meaning of death and destruction. And that whole set of terms that you've been willing to accept about your lives, and that the rest of America has accepted about its lives, that term has become synonymous with death and oppression around the world today. And that the task that you and I have before us is really the task of constructing that wholly new kind of consciousness to build a society upon. That it's a new way of life that you and I have to build, not simply a new policy. And it's not a case of new laws, it's a case of new lawgivers. And I think the statement that you and I can make in this bloody world that has some kind of cogency and meaning is a very simple statement. That's the statement that all men are brothers. And that if we're to seek to organize a society around principles, then the principle we organize that around is man's brotherhood. And that we build that not into a far-off notion, not into simply an ideal, but that gets built, in fact, into a political force. That we make brotherhood not something talked about, but something lived. I think as of each of you face the problem of trying to live a message of brotherhood to this world, every young man in this audience between the ages of 18 and 35 runs into a particular system. That system is a system of military conscription in this country, known as the selective service system. Think for a moment, as we try and understand what participating in that system means, we can deal with a few of its basic assumptions. The most obvious assumption of military conscription is that the lives of young people in this country belong not to those young people, that the energies of those lives are not to be directed by those lives themselves, that those lives in fact are not the property of those people that supposedly possess them, but rather those lives exist as tools and property of the state. And that those lives exist at the will of that state, and when the state decides there's a new policy of international murder that needs to be done, then those lives are the tools that they instrument it with. And what that system represents is really the dispossession of thousands of lives in this country. And the dispossession is of your life and the person next to you. I think the second assumption about conscription that we could talk about is perhaps not as obvious, but may be the most important thing about it. And that is, for a moment, I'd like you to think of your draft cards as an educational mechanism. You were given a draft card in order to teach you a way of thinking about yourself and a way of thinking about the people around you. And as you try to understand what has been taught that way, I think it comes down to a basic fact about the motive energy of lives. And that is, young people in this country have been consistently taught through that system and through participation in that how to live their lives under the auspices of fear. How continually to make decision after decision after decision, and to see constantly through that fear. And I think we live in a society that can be characterized by that kind of fear. As we try and trace down the blindness of America and the blindness of the world, what we can understand that blindness to come from is what's been organized in this world is a politics of fear. And that fear is not just a psychological fact, that fear is a social organization. And that you daily walk through the social organization of that fear. And men daily go out and act out its message, which is to murder all their brothers around the world. And that if there's to be any difference in this world, then it means you acting out of that fear. That you're taking your life and saying, no longer do you live it under the auspices of fear. No longer is your life simply going to mean another block, another stone on that great wall of fear that has surrounded men, but rather you affirm something else with your life. That as you look at that life, there's certainly more there than fear. Well, we'll organize that thing besides fear. And I think the third thing about conscription that we can talk about is the most obvious fact. That is, 80% of the people in the world today live in conditions of absolute misery. If we're to try and understand what it is that stands between those people and some happiness, some fulfillment, some fruition for their lives, then the first roadblock we run into is the American military. That conscription system is used to raise an army. That army is used to destroy. Armies were invented for destruction. That is the only purpose for which an army exists. And if we're to try and speak to those lives, and those are in fact the lives of our brothers, then the first thing we can do is try and break those chains on them. And the greatest chain that exists upon them is the decision by the American people and decision by people around the world that they'd much rather kill people than feed them. That they'd much rather see those people die in the agonies of bombing than live through the agonies of starvation. That's been a decision. That's a priority of our civilization. And until you destroy that military structure, which has meant nothing but oppression for those people, it will constantly be the priority of our civilization. I think those are very clear meanings of conscription. And what you and I can understand is that that system of conscription is not General Hershey, is not Lyndon Johnson, is not anyone that voted on that bill, is not any clerk at any local board. The selective service system of the United States is every man who carries a draft card. That system is built upon people's submission. As you continue to submit, it's not you submitting to an outside force, it's you being selective service. And that if you want to find responsibility for the existence of that system, then look to your draft card, because that is the basic brick and mortar of that system. The great trap of it is not that it's been imposed upon you, but that you've accepted it. The great trap of it is not that they've sent police around to enforce it, but that you've been willing to enforce it yourselves. And I think to that system and to everything it means in this society, you and I can make that statement. You and I can stand up with our brothers around the world and say, no more will my life be used to destroy those lives. That if this life of mine is to have meaning, then the meaning it has is in the context of all life. And that I use my life for that life. And that there's a choice that each of you faces in modern America. And that's a choice which has to do with basic forces. And there are a whole set of forces in this society which represent the forces of death. And there are a whole set of forces which represent a hope for life. And you're going to have to decide which one of those you want to stand with, because you can't stand with both. And as long as you continue to be the selective service system of the United States, you won't be able to stand with life. And if you decide you want to stand with life in this country, it means you're going to take on perhaps a new social role. That new social role is that of criminal. To take that stance, to take your life back for yourself away from military conscription, means that you may spend up to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Monday, I go on trial in the city of San Francisco for the heinous crime of having refused to cooperate with the American military. What I'd say is that I can find no more honorable position to be in modern America than that of a criminal. And I think that there's nothing that can lessen that 5 years for any of you, but I think one thing to understand is that that 5 years is no comparison to the price most people pay. And most people around the world have had to pay the price of life itself. Your 5 years is small in comparison. And that act of yours is not going to be an act by itself which is going to pull a structure down. It's going to be a small act. But all that's given to each of us in this world is to do his bit. None of you are going to find the magic formula that tears it down all of a sudden. What it's going to mean is you doing that portion that you can do. What it's going to mean is you taking your life and doing what you can with that, and joining that with other lives. I think around the country, young people have stood up and done that. The resistance, in a total of 3 national actions, has collected 3,000 draft cards. I think you can stand with those people. And you can stand and make that statement. And you can stand and say, enough. No more blood. You can say that you're sick of having your lives be used for destruction. You can say, rather, you're going to use your life to build a new house for men. A house where men live together. And whatever the price that's forced upon us, whatever it is that you and I have to do to bring that into being, we will do. And that the allegiance we owe is not to a flag, and is not to a set of institutions, and is not to a political rhetoric. The allegiance that we owe is to the fact of those lives themselves, and that overrides any of those other supposed allegiances. That is the one important thing that you and I can build in this world, is a new life for ourselves and for people around the world. And any other action really becomes meaningless in the face of their suffering. And what we'd ask you to do is join us now. Stand up. And the one thing I'm sure of is that if you don't, it never will happen. That price that's put on this kind of act is put there for a specific reason. It's put there under the assumption that you will choose the day-to-day pleasures of living in modern America, of driving from gas station to hamburger stand to gas station to hamburger stand. You'll choose all that before you'll choose some vague, far-off notion like brotherhood. And the assumption that we come under is obviously a different one, which is before all those hamburger stands and before all those gas stations, you really have a priority in your life. And that priority really is to find that thing that you describe as meaning. And the assumption we come with is that that life has no meaning outside of the context of all life. And that you'll stand with something like brotherhood, you'll stand with that kind of hope before you'll choose those pleasures. And I think that's the choice you're going to have to make. And I think if you choose in favor of conscription, then everything it represents will grow and prosper in this world. And if you refuse that conscription, then I think we have a hope. We have a hope that someday there might be such a thing as a real brotherhood of men, and that thing will be built upon our lives.
Thank you. First, I want to announce that following this rally, the Mime and Kathy Pine Troupe will perform.
Kathy Pine will sing.
Oh, Kathy Pine will sing and the Mime Troupe will perform. I know it's a bit inconvenient, but this is the only way we'll be able to do it. As far as questions and answers, those of you having any, if you could just speak as loudly as you can, or from wherever you are, and then we'll try and answer them.
Also, during at least part of the speech, there were collection buckets passed around. I don't know if they made it all the way around the crowd, but we're going to send them back through again. That's money for the resistance to help us continue to do this kind of work. And if any of you want to put draft cards in those buckets also, we'll be glad to take them. Do people have questions?
It's a hell of a lot easier for me to sit here and live in a world of expediency. That expediency being that doing things the easy way. It's easy for me not to turn in my draft card, to comply. And I want you to answer me and tell me why I should take the hard way and not the easy way. Why I can't satisfy myself by talking brotherhood rather than acting.
The question, do people hear the question? The question, a rough paraphrase, is that it's much easier to keep going on as he's going on and keep his draft card, and that turning back his draft card would be the hard way, and wanted a reason for taking the hard way. Well, we've been talking for the last half hour about reasons to why to take the hard way, but I don't know. Maybe I'm insane, but I've never really figured out that it was the hard way. I mean, I've always taken the easy way all my life, and I felt sending back my draft card was the easiest way. I mean, it got much too heavy to carry that thing. I'd much rather have gotten rid of it. And, I mean, it's easy depending on what, on something much more basic in your life than easy or hard. I mean, if you decide you want to live a certain way, then it becomes easy to send the draft card back. I mean, if if you're fighting to go on another way, then it's very hard to send that back. And what I'd say is, I mean, if you're having a hard time, I don't know that I can make it easier. But what I'd say is that, that I can't offer any rationale for making it easy, except that, that there's a lot more at stake than simply those pleasures of yours. I mean, there's a whole world that's at stake. And if that makes it any easier, then I'd say send it back.
I'd like to answer that briefly too, and I don't know whether it's a real answer for you or not. But I think by your making your decision and not something as barbaric as selective service making your decision, it is a much more joyous life. And if you have meaning in your life, then when we're in jail or out of jail, that meaning isn't discontinued, but there's real joy. And it isn't something that someone's put upon you, but it's something that you've understood and lived through. And then there's a chance for real happiness.
Is there any way of getting all the turned off people in America today? Is there any way of making them understand and really understand what you're talking about?
The question was, is there any way of getting all the turned off people in America today and making them really understand what we're talking about? Well, obviously we're making an attempt at that. I mean, here we are today, and I've been doing this for the last year and a half of my life. And what I'd say is that the best hope there is for getting them to understand it is by doing it. I mean, that the real way you have to speaking to people is not simply with a set of words, but really with a life. And that each of you may feel very much isolated, but the fact is each of you has a constituency. I mean, for every life here, there are 20 other lives that watch that life. And each of you have that very real kind of constituency. And as you make moves with your life, those people watch, those people feel, those people understand, or begin to understand those moves. And I think that that's the way you can speak to people and begin speaking to people with your life. And all I'd say is that I've seen examples of people understanding it which might be close to miraculous. I mean, we started the resistance a little over a year ago, myself and 2 other people. And at that time, we never expected ever to get close to 3,000 draft cards. I mean, we began at 3. We just went out and started rapping to people, and what happened is more and more and more people responded. And I'd say the best example, I think it's a question simply of finding the language to talk to people with. I mean, and giving that language some substance with your life. Like once I went to talk about draft resistance in Marysville, California. I don't know if any of you know Marysville, California, but it's anything but the heart of American radicalism. And I told people I was going to Marysville to talk about draft resistance, and everyone said, "What? Where should we send your body?" And so I got up there, and there's about 200 people in the auditorium, and I figured, wow, how in the hell am I ever going to talk to these people about draft resistance, And I looked at them, and I figured, well, they all go to church on Sunday. So I stood up and did 2 hours worth of Jesus rap, and at the end of it, about half of them came up and said, wow, draft resistance, I never quite heard it talked about that way. And, and started giving money, and saying, wow, anything we can do. And I was perfectly amazed at that. And I think the problem is none of us really really can know the effect that we have upon other people. I mean, that's one of the hard things. Is that you're never really fully aware of that, of that kind of effect that you have in other people's lives. But I think the way it's going to come about is when people begin living that out on the streets. I mean, I think that more than anything else is going to bring that impetus, that's going to bring people to understanding. The question was, do I think if this really works and the draft is removed, do I think the people of the United States are going to be free, and how will they ever be free of the ruling class of this country? And first, I mean, the obvious tactic is that we're not going to remove the draft, we're going to destroy it. And there's 2 very different ideas. One would be the idea of appealing to a government to remove this great imposition on us, and we have not made any appeal such as that to the government. What we said is we're not going to have anything to do with it. which means rather than the government deciding they want to remove it, it means that it's impossible for them to do anything else but let it fall apart because there's nothing to be a part of it. And I think, no, I don't think the people of the United States will be free after the draft is destroyed. I don't think they're going to be free until the United States is destroyed and the whole concept of the United States and the whole concept of nation state is destroyed. And at that point, they won't finally be free either. And to what do I owe my existence? Food, water, air, kind of. But, I think they're ultimately going to be trapped by that notion of nation state. And I think the only thing that's going to get them out of that is a real affirmation of brotherhood. And I'd say I don't believe there's a ruling class in America. Not that there isn't a small segment of people who make decisions, but that the fact is that those people are powerless to make decisions outside of people's submission. And that a ruling class is meaningless without a submissive class. And if people can learn not to submit their lives to those kind of decisions, then there is no such thing as a ruling class with the powers of a ruling class. And I think, an example, of course, is something like elections, which are now taking place. And that is what we have to understand, is the most powerless person in this nation today is the President of the United States. That no more than if you went to the beach, and there's somebody surfing out in the water, and you said, "Wow, look at him push that wave." Well, that's the same thing as saying that the president of this country pushes this country around. He's just sitting up there on top of a great big wave, and you're the wave. And when the people of this country decide they're going to live in a different fashion, then that's what's going to make the difference, and not a new person on top there. And I think all those people that would ride on top of the society ride on top of that society not by virtue of themselves, but by virtue of the wave supporting them. And that what you can attempt to do is really build a new political base in this country that's going to undercut that whole notion of how we're going to live and build a whole new one. The question was, what about working against the draft in the Constitution and proving the draft unconstitutional? Well, I'd say that's not the point. I mean, obviously, I think the corruption of the society is something really beyond the Constitution. I mean, that the Constitution is not going to save anything. The Constitution is just an instrument that that reflects the society. And until you build that new social base, the Constitution is going to be absolutely meaningless. And what's important is not that people understand that it's unconstitutional. What people understand is it's synonymous with murder, and they decide with their lives that they're not going to murder anymore. I mean, appealing to the Constitution is going back and appealing to that great father again. Saying, "Gee, Daddy, this is the wrong step. You can see by the rules of daddyhood here." Well, I think we destroy the whole notion of daddyhood. I think that's the meaningful thing you can do with your act about the draft. And if you stop simply at trying to get that law proved to be not in fact a good law, and I think you ignore the fact that that law simply reflects the whole civilization we're a part of, and that what we have to aim at is all those forces behind the draft and behind the Constitution. And I think by trying to work inside that framework of the Constitution or that framework of legality, you miss the whole point of what's behind that legality. Forget the if so. The question was, are there any candidates that are pointing toward the new political world or the new world that we're talking about? And I'd say no, I don't think so. I haven't seen one. And it seems to me if they were, they wouldn't be candidates any longer. The question is, what would be the effect of the unilateral destruction of the American nation-state complex? And the answer is the mind of the world would be absolutely blown. The question was, if I can roughly paraphrase it, do I think the idea of conscription, war, etc., is tied up with the notion of government, which is in itself built upon the notion of the use of armed force by a group which is inhuman against people which are human. I'd say roughly yes. I think what it's really tied up is in a notion of authority. I mean, beyond simply the idea of governmental systems, that the authority that's constantly been exercised is the parental form of authority. I think a form of authority that one could talk about as opposed to that is a fraternal form of authority. I mean, that it's been constantly the position of one person or one set of people exercising the force upon a whole group of people. And I think rather than that, you build a fraternal model of authority in which authority is in completely the people's hands and just in the people's hands. And I'm sure that in a world of brotherhood there would probably be some form of government, but the government would reflect the idea of brotherhood and not the idea of government. Okay, a more serious answer about the unilateral destruction of the American nation state. Okay, I think the effect, the initial effect was exactly what I talked about, and that is that the international politics today is a house of cards. Half of those cards belong to the American deck. I mean, if you look at the armies around the world, each of those armies does not exist independent of itself. It leans against another army. You destroy the American armies and you destroy the notion of American nation state, and I think the whole house of cards falls. Now, I think if what you're after is a protection of the integrity of the idea of nation state, then a solution like resistance at the present time and nonviolence is not going to work. I think if what you're after is in fact a brotherhood of man, then I think it will work. Now, let's take the hypothetical situation that everyone sets up. That is, we destroy all of our armaments, say we're not going to live along the idea of nation state, but really going to choose brotherhood. And sure enough, as you're all making it out to the beach, you look out there and here come, the Chinese sandpans, the slant-eyed devils of road all the way across while we were destroying our weapons. So I think the proper response to that ought to be to run down to the beach and say, aha, a chance to liberate the Chinese. And I think what you begin then is trying to relate to those people in a fashion that they really begin to understand their own humanity and the humanity of the people they're dealing with, which, to my mind, the one way I'm sure that won't work is that if you go down there and shoot them. And I think the best example we have of someone dealing with like an invasion in that fashion is the example of Gandhi in India. Now, the beautiful thing about Gandhi in India was not only did he repulse a British invasion, but he was able in the process to in some way civilize the British, which Western civilization had been unable to do for 2,000 years. And I think what you have to understand is that you have just as big an obligation to those people that would invade as to those people who are being invaded. And the obligation you have is really that of building a human life and building a society of human life. And I think that it's really hard for us to imagine America giving up that notion of nation state. And it's hard for us. It's equally hard for me to imagine a world where we gave that up and there hadn't been a similar kind of direction on the part of everyone. But I think that would be the can opener to begin to break down internationally that whole idea of nation state. And I think that'll never happen until people do it. I think that won't be the end of the work by any means. I think then there's a hell of a lot of more work to do. But I think then we're in a position to do that work. And until we've done that, we're not. Question, is there anything in our program beyond draft resistance? Well, obviously we talk about draft resistance as really one act in a whole way of life. And so that program is that way of life. We're not especially big on programs. And the reason we're not big on programs as such is I think our basic distrust of the idea of program, which is that most people who ask for a program are people who, walking on the dotted line between point A and point B in the present society, want to know which dotted line between which 2 points do they walk in the new society. We'd hope to bring a different notion of leading a human life than that. And what I'd say is I think that there's that message and there's that that set of assumptions that we're trying to build. Now, however that's acted out, we're going to act it out. I think one thing it obviously means is the development of wholly new kinds of social forms. It means it means destroying things like the present university. It means destroying the whole present notion of education. It means building whole new economic forms also. I mean, we've done a few little things that way, like we've experimented with the idea of commune and developing communes as part of the resistance in an attempt to develop a new social form. And that's all been very experimental. What I'd say, in final answer to that is that we've had our hands full just trying to do draft resistance. And one answer to the development of more programs would be if more people joined us. At present, we find ourselves more or less exhausted by the task of trying to build that draft resistance. And one thing I'm sure of is that people have made the kind of dedication of their lives to it that is going to be acted out, not simply to the point where they get to prison, but it's going to be acted out through that and all the way for the rest of their lives. The question was, what part does organized religion play in the New World? I haven't really figured it out, but if they keep going the same direction they're going now, I doubt if they'll play any part at all. Okay, we got a written question we'll answer, which is, what do you feel is the obligation of human beings as brothers of other human beings when a situation such as the Hitler one arises, when one maniac is organizing the systematic destruction of millions of other lives? What do we in the intermediate stage before the concept of human brotherhood is totally accepted do? Well, I'd like to talk generally in a historical description of that whole Hitler thing and America's favorite war, namely World War II. And what I'd say, if we're trying to make a historical judgment on who won World War II, what we can reasonably say is that the German armies lost, and the American armies lost, and fascism won. And we can make that statement because I think what you have in life is what you do. Not what you describe it under, but what you do. And the way, if you'll pardon my language, I always like to express that as if you do shit for 20 years, what you've got left at the end of 20 years is a pile of shit. And what that means is that historically here was a nation aroused by the inhumanity of another nation. I mean, here was the example of the Germans. I mean, conducting a clearly inhumane way of relating to the entire world. I mean, that they conducted the first mass bombing of civilian populations, they put people in concentration camps, etc., etc., etc. So the response of those people interested in saving humanity was to leap into that war. Well, by 2 years after they had leapt into that war, those people who were saving humanity had dropped a ring of firebombs around the city of Dresden and let it burn to the center, had dropped a ring of firebombs around the city of Tokyo and let it do the same, had dropped atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, to the point where at the end of that glorious war to save humanity, the saviors of humanity had killed more people than the people who had gone out to destroy humanity. Now, what I think that means is that at the end of that war, there was no qualitative difference between either side. Both of those sides stood for the destruction of humanity. And I think that if one is out to defend freedom, then the first obligation one has upon oneself is to be free in the defense of that. If one's out to defend humanity, then the first obligation you have is to defend is to be humane in the defense of that humanity. I mean, those are the restrictions that are placed upon each of us if you really want to defend those things. And understand that the greatest enemy towards those things is not other people, but ourselves. And I think we have a couple examples of how to deal with that. And the one is of course Gandhi's example. And Gandhi was dealing with just as fascistic, just as racist, just as supposedly inhuman a set of oppressors as the Germans ever were, which is namely the colonial British. And, once again, the magnificent thing was that he was also able to speak to those British lives, not simply destroy them. And the other example is one specifically in the context of the German occupation of Europe, which is the Danish resistance, in which some forms of nonviolent resistance were used to those Danes, or were used by those Danes to the Germans. For example, the first thing the Germans did when they moved into Denmark was order that every Jew had to wear a yellow armband with the Star of David on it. Well, the next morning, there are all these 6'5" blonde sons of bitches out wearing yellow armbands, and it turns out everybody in Denmark has got a yellow armband on. So it becomes impossible then to pull the Jews out of the population, and it becomes impossible to send them off to extermination camps. Another good example was, as part of the great German occupation, of course, the German leaders come and speak to the occupied people. So Goering was coming to the opera house So the Danes went down and bought out all the tickets to his speech. When he showed up to speak, there was a completely empty hall. And in the course of all kinds of actions like that, they began talking to the German troops. So the amazing thing in occupied Denmark was that was the one place in all of Europe where they had the problem of mutinies amongst German troops. That they had to put 3 fresh German armies into the small country of Denmark, simply because as the Danes began to rap with the German troops, they began to refuse orders. I think the example there is clearly that armies around the world are raised in exactly the same way. I mean, the exact same way you raise them here, you raise them any place else. That is, you teach every young man from the time he's born that if he doesn't grab his rifle and go out and shoot the first thing that runs by with a wrong flag over its head, his mother's going to be raped, and the Chinese equivalent of apple pie is going to be stomped into the dust, and everything good, sacred, and meaningful and clean in the world is going to be destroyed. Well, I'm sure that's as big a lie elsewhere as it is here. And I think the task that you have is A, understanding that lie, and B, acting like you understand it. And if it's a lie that people have been given, then I don't think the answer to people's oppression through a lie like that is to shoot them. And I think the answer is obviously that those people are just as human as you are. It's a question of freeing them to see that humanity. And I'm sure you'll never do that by shooting them. I'm sure the only way to do that is to behave like a human being.
Would you comment on the alternative of conscientious objection?
A comment on the alternative of conscientious objection. I'd say that at one point I was considering to be a conscientious objector, and I got to the point of filling the form out. And I looked at the form, and there's this place where you're supposed to, in space of 12 lines, put your reasons for being a conscientious objector. And as I started to think about those reasons, what became clear to me was exactly the reasons I was laying down for being a conscientious objector were the reasons I was going to be a non-cooperator with the draft. And that is that the whole system I was trying to make an appeal of conscientious objection to did not exist for the purposes of benefiting humanity as I wanted to through my conscientious objection. Rather, they existed for the purpose of destroying humanity. And there was an absolute contradiction between what I felt and what I was participating in. And I think through accepting any kind of form of deferment or, being registered in any fashion, you do that. I mean, you may have your own particular reason for taking any particular position, and they're all very varied. But what's unanimous about all of them is that they're all part of a system which has one direction. That is destruction and oppression. And that system in itself stands for something. And your participation in that system, whatever your reasons for participating, whatever your deferment, really give energy, to one direction. And that is to a system which has done what selective service has done. So that, I really feel myself to be simply more of a conscientious objector than the law allows. About martyrdom? Do you have a question? What do I believe about martyrdom? Yeah, the question was, what do I believe about martyrdom? And what I'd say, martyrs are generally people who historically acted too early or too late. And all I hope for is we're acting at the right time. And I think that martyrs don't create martyrs, or the people that end up being martyrs aren't the ones that created that role for themselves. The people that create the role of martyrs for other people, and that is, obviously behind the question is the question of whether in resisting the draft you become a martyr. Well, I'd say if we do become martyrs, which I don't think we will, we become martyrs because you didn't join us. Yeah. The question was, do I think it's necessary to build these things by entering an institution like a prison, or wouldn't it be better to go someplace where people were already closer to them and work with it there? I'd say first, I don't know any place like that. I mean, as I look around the world and try and find that, that idol of brotherhood somewhere, it just doesn't seem to be there. What what I'd say is that I don't understand my act as going to prison. I understand my act as non-cooperation with the draft. One of the consequences of that is that I'm going to be sent to jail. That consequence is not the defining fact about it. I mean, it's simply a price tag that's on it. And what I'd say is I'd much rather non-cooperate with the draft and go to jail than cooperate with the draft and stay out of jail. I mean, I'm no great fan of jail by any means. I got a lot to stay out for like everybody else. But what I'd say is that's just a price there. And what's going to carry me into that position of being in jail, it seems to me, is the best of actions that one can take in the present situation. I mean, what's going to take you to jail is not ideal by any means. But the alternatives to it are much less ideal. A, you could keep your draft card, which I think is the worst alternative. B, you could go underground, as the phrase is. And my general response to that is that what America needs to be taught is not how to live underground, but how to live overground, because most of them have been living underground for all of their lives. And what you have to do is make an open and honest statement to them and teach them that they can live those things they've been keeping in their back closet out on the streets. And I think that's the only way you're going to be able to reach people in this country. The third alternative is, of course, to split. What I'd say is, the most common place to split is Canada. I'd say I wouldn't go to Canada to try and escape cancer. I wouldn't go to Canada to try and escape the disease that America's gotten down to. I mean, that's going to be there. And I think what you do by running to Canada is put yourself in a position of being completely irrelevant to the lives in this country. And I think what we ought to do is really try and make a statement to those lives, and make a statement to how those lives are being used. So what that leaves you with is a position of ending up going to jail. Now, the rules, or what we always say about jail and the resistance, is two things. A, our general attitude toward it is, when in Los Angeles, do Los Angeles. When in jail, do jail. Jail's just another place, and you're going to have to treat it like that. And the other one is that before you go to jail, you leave two people to do your work. And if you leave two people to do your work, then we're going to be in good shape. But if you just sit around and go to jail, then your act has become basically worthless, to an organization like the Resistance. So we try and get people to use the fact that they're going to have to go to jail as a way of speaking to other people's lives. I mean, not just to sit around and wait for that, but to really go out and do work in the meantime. And I think if people do that, that we'll be in all right shape. And last thing I like to do, I always like to tell one jail story, just to lighten people's minds about jail. And it's about a guy who was arrested for resisting the draft in Atlanta, Georgia. And the police came to his house and arrested him, and he looked at him and he said, "Well, by power of the state, you take control of my body. Take care of it." At that point, lay down on the floor, refused to talk, refused to move, refused to eat. And they kind of, looked at him for a second, what's this cat doing? And picked him up and took him to jail, and then took him from jail into the courtroom and got him, laid him on the floor of the courtroom. And the judge kind of, looked over his bench, down at him, and all the lawyers were around him saying, "Come on, defend yourself, justice is at work here, stand up, make your case." And he didn't, he just laid there. And so they picked him up and they took him off to prison. And they, for about 6 months in prison, they mopped up after him, and did all you do for someone who doesn't move or talk or eat. And finally they came into his cell and they said, "Look, you're too much trouble. We're going to send you home." And he looked up at me and said, "Take the body back where you found it." And made him pick him up and carry him back to his living room in Atlanta, Georgia. And he got up and walked off. Well, I tell that just as a way of illustrating the fact that jail's your gig. What you decide to do with it is what happens there. And you can go to jail and be miserable and feel oppressed, or you can go to jail and act like a free man. And one thing I'll guarantee, if you go to jail and act like a free man, the jail's not going to be there long. I mean, there's nothing that bends and breaks a jail faster than the fact that there are people that go there and don't think of themselves as criminals. The courtroom and the jail amount to a whole set of roles. That is, the people that go up before the court and the people that go into jail think of themselves as criminals and act like criminals and act like guilty people. And the prisoners run the jails. Most of the guarding is done by trustees. And everybody consistently acts those roles out. Well, I think when you go in that context of jail and don't act like you are guilty, what happens is that whole set of fears and assumptions that the jail is begins to crumble. And we had like a few examples of that out of the Oakland demonstrations, last winter and fall at the Oakland Induction Center. And, when people ended up out at Santa Rita Rehabilitation Center, which is a euphemism for the Alameda County Jail. And one of the things, I remember one incident, which was that it was sunny in October, so that we were all kept in all political prisoners were kept in a compound by themselves. So out in the middle of the compound, there were always a bunch of people lying around naked, sunbathing, And, the guards that walk by and go, oh, Jesus, God. Turn around and go back. And so finally one day, one of the guards was on who wasn't particularly fond of us, and he walked by and he saw some guys kicking it. There was the usual set of sunbathers, and he walked by and he saw some guys kicking a basketball around, playing soccer. And he said, hey, don't kick the basketball around, you're going to ruin the basketball. I said, okay, fine, sure. So he comes by about 15 minutes later, and two new guys who hadn't heard him say this were kicking the basketball around. And he says, hey, I told you guys not to kick that, give it to me. And so I had to throw it over the fence to him. And he left it right outside the fence and walked down the compound about 30 yards and, waiting for us to jump over the fence to get the basketball. Now, nobody jumped over the fence, and they were just kind of leaning there looking at it and looking up at him, leaning, looking. And so finally he comes down and he starts talking to those people. And then some guy comes up who didn't know what was happening and said, hey, why don't you give us our basketball back? And at this point, he really got angry, and he said, and he looked out and he saw all these people lying out there naked, and he said, hey, you guys can't do that here. If you don't put your clothes back on, I'm gonna send you to Greystone. And Greystone is the maximum security, the hole. And people's response to that immediately and spontaneously was, hey, wow, we get to go to Greystone. Everybody ran in and got their clothes and lined up at the gate, and said, hey, we're going to Greystone. Wow, and so here there's 90 people sitting there in line waiting to go to Greystone, and the guard ran back up the compound and found the captain, and there was this, there was kind of a summit conference out of which everyone, agreed to wear pants, and the whole thing was closed off. But, by behaving in such a fashion, that whole set of fears and assumptions of the jail all of a sudden came crumbling down at the guard's feet. And I think that, if you're going to have to approach a decision which is eventually going to send you to jail, then understand that the only frightening thing about jail is that it's a little more honest than the rest of the world. I mean, the guards are called guards, and the prisoners are called prisoners, and the guards guard the prisoners, and the prisoners are prisoners of the guards, and it's all out there on the table very openly and very clearly. And I don't think we're used to functioning in such an honest world. And nobody calls the guards, administrators, deans, or senators or whatever. I'm sure the only problem you really have is dealing with that honesty. The question was about what kind of sentences people are getting and what has been done in the courts. And sentences vary from court to court. In San Francisco now, the average sentence is around 18 months, and the last sentence that was handed out was 6 months, 12 months probation. And I think that's the result of some hard work we've done in the courts, which is to make the courts into a human situation, to really go there not acting out that role of criminal, and therefore refusing to let the judge act out the role of judge, so that it all becomes all of a sudden a very human situation. For example, the court, we always pack the courtroom with our people, so as the judge sits up on the bench, he stares out at this great crowd of old ladies and little babies and people with hair down to their feet and all kinds of weird looking people, and it's a great camp scene there at the courtroom with people. Oh, hi, I haven't seen you since the last trial, and wow, too much. Old Zerpely's on the bench again, and the federal attorney comes in. Everyone's, oh, hi, how are you? How are you? And it comes as, it's like all, a whole set of old friends getting together again. And then we have people, going up there, and our attitude toward the trial is that the trial is theater. Everybody goes there and writes his script, and whatever you want to act out there at the trial, that's fine by us. I mean, there's certain few limitations we put on it. We had a guy in Tucson who wanted to go to his trial naked, and we tried to talk him out of that one. But generally we just try and get people to go there, and instead of trying to make an appeal on legal reasons so that the lawyer talks Latin to the judge and the judge talks Latin back to the lawyer, and he's either guilty or innocent, but nobody knows what happened in between time, we try and get people to make that very real statement with their lives of how it is they got there, and confront judges with a human situation, and confront everybody there with a human situation. And what that does is slowly wear people down, so that now it becomes a very real human decision for a judge to send someone off to jail. It's not just a question of shuffling papers any longer. It's really a question of dealing with a life, and I think they're very well aware of that now. And the biggest effect we've had is upon prosecutors. That the people who've been forced to go out and prosecute our cases don't want to prosecute them any longer. I mean, so like what happens? The guy's prosecuting. Well, he goes down to the cafeteria to eat lunch, in a recess in the trial, and he sits down and finds 6 trays of resistance people around him, who start rapping at him, and then then there's an intermission, and he's surrounded by resistance people who keep rapping at him, and and we treat him like an old friend. He's just one of the boys, and pretty soon he doesn't like prosecuting us anymore. And slowly that human fact has begun to happen in the courtrooms. And I think it's all based on our willingness not to jump into the psychology of enemy. I mean, the people's willingness not to go to a judge or the courtroom or go to any of those people and treat them as though they were enemies. You go and try and cut past that role of judge and treat the person like a human being, and constantly to begin destroying those roles. And I think there's a guy on trial now in Los Angeles who's, been, from what I understand, been making a remarkable attempt at doing this. A guy named Joan Baez, who I guess is from UCLA, and I don't know when his next court appearance is, but I encourage you all to go down and see Joe do his thing. I understand it's quite powerful. June 8th. Oh, there's Joe. There's Joe. Stand up, Joe. This is. He goes into court again on June 18th. So I recommend you all come down there and see it. It's probably the best thing playing in Los Angeles. Federal Courthouse Judge Stevens, June 18th. Do you have a co-feature they have?
It may change. He may not be able to schedule it then. He's going to go on vacation during July.
This is all tentative on when the judge takes his vacation. More questions?
Girl over there.
Where?
Lady.
Don't sound like it's so bad.
Chinese, honey.
Yeah, you must be from New York. You're afraid of the Russians. Most everybody out here is afraid of the Chinese.
I'll give David a cigarette break and tell you just one little incident, just to give you some idea of alternatives. This is not on a large scale or political scale, but it's a typical question that's asked that's in the same vein as yours to the poor pacifist. What would you do if somebody stuck a gun in your ribs? And all us pacifists have to have lived through that hypothetical situation several thousand times in order to prove our point. Well, I really don't like hypothetical situations because all they have is hypothetical answers. But I can tell you one real situation, which is when Ira, the man who spoke first here, one night in San Francisco was stepping off the train, and it was nighttime, and he was going to a Quaker meeting, and somebody came up and stuck a gun in his ribs and said, "Give me all your money." And Ira said, "No, I'll give you half." And it's a really terrible thing to do to a crook. And the guy jumped back about 3 feet and then said, "No, give me all your money." That's all he kind of was, the way he was trained to think. And I said, "No, I'm serious. If you want all my money, you're going to have to take it, but I'd be happy to give you half." Also, probably, if Ira hadn't needed the money to eat and to get home, he probably would have given him more than half or maybe all. But, he at least he'd been a pacifist for the last 20 years, and he had it arranged so he could think in the situation rather than either run, throw up, or club the guy. And so he just repeated. He said, "No, I'll give you half." And the crook said again, "Give me all your money." And Ira said, "You look hungry. Have you had dinner?" He said, "I haven't eaten in 3 days." And so they had dinner together. And afterwards, Ira said, "Now, we'll split the difference." And the guy said, No, I wouldn't take your money. I'll never do that again in my life," and everything. But that's just a one-to-one relation, but we've been trained to think that there's no other way, and I don't know whether you're here when David said, well, we thought that on this coast you'd be worried about the Chinese, so he used the example of the Chinese coming up on the beach. And what is it you're so afraid of? Is it that we're so passive and so insecure that, say, the Chinese swoop in, Chinese communists take over the government? What you're afraid of is that you will then be a communist. I mean, you will then accept all the orders that are handed out by the government. What we're saying is that if you know where your feet are on the ground, you say, it's ridiculous to have boundaries. Sure, come on up, have some tea or sake or matzo balls or whatever you want, but I'm not going to follow out your orders, which is what resistance is saying. Then you don't have a problem of who's going to be running your government. Secondly, we're not offering you a guarantee that you're going to live forever. I mean, in running down to the beach and greeting these mythical invaders, we can't guarantee that you're not going to get shot. We can almost guarantee that you will get shot if you go down to the beach with a gun. No, that's about all. Thank you. Pardon me? Oh, God. He wants to come up and make his point. Do you have a question? Okay. Can you ask it from where you are? No, okay. That's all right. Whale.
My name is Yuri Glebovich Nikolaichik. I was born in a communist country, and I came here as a refugee. And you talk about pacifism, and you talk about freedom, and you talk about flower power, and all this is very good. I love it. However, the communists took over my country, and they came in and they said that we will give you freedom, and they put in a dictatorship of the party. They came in and they said that you will have your type of government, you will have democracy, and they put my friends in concentration camps. And believe me, that this flower power of my friends didn't do them any good. The only power that we saw were the bayonets, the machine guns, the concentration camps. I have a friend. His name is Andrei Naumovich Mushenko, and he was a teacher in a small village. And one day they came and arrested him, and they put him in a camp. And he asked, "What did I do?" And they said, "Do you think we'll give you a chance to do something?" So I only say that practice pacifism. That is great because you can afford it. But when you are faced with a totalitarian power like I have seen it, pacifism is regarded as a weakness and nothing more. And those who do not subscribe to their ideology are put in concentration camps or exterminated. More than any other system, communism is built on a lie. Let me finish.
Well, make your question.
And so, when communism comes into a peasant country, they promise them land, and they put them on collectives. And I will finish the same way that I began. They promise them freedom, and they give them dictatorship of the party. They promise them wealth, and they put them in concentration camps. Thank you very much for your patience and pacifism.
I have a friend too, and his name is David Harris, and he's going to go to trial Monday, and most likely he'll be convicted. And people will probably come and arrest him and put him in a concentration camp. I go for induction June 12th, which I will refuse. Joe Maislich is going to trial the 18th. We will probably be convicted, and we will be arrested, and we will put in concentration camps. What they're talking about, the Hungarian people had a valiant struggle, and at the time I supported it. It was violent, and I can understand your anxiety. However, they're still in Hungary putting people in concentration camps. It didn't really accomplish what it set out to do, although I supported the people and their aims at the time. I still do. Thank you.
we're going to have to close this off, and let me make a general statement, which is that I recognize that people have been born all around the world. The problem is no one has ever lived anywhere. And I think that's the problem that we face. I feel for your friends in Hungary, but I also feel, when I was listening to, what I thought was if you'd had a Vietnamese accent, you would have been talking about Americans. And I can understand your reaction to totalitarianism. I think what you have to understand also is that totalitarianism takes a number of different forms, and that your description of going in and saying we're going to give people freedom and giving people, in essence, death is exactly what is done not only simply in communist countries, but also done in all those countries described as capitalistic countries. And if there's ever to be a way out of that, it means building a third alternative between those two systems. And if you're to try to understand how those Russian soldiers put your friends in concentration camps, you can either say those Russian soldiers are absolutely inhuman, which will probably be a lie, or you can say that those are people that have been duped, that have been cheated, or that have been lied to. And I don't ever remember talking about anything like flower power, and I'm really not quite sure what flower power is, but what I'd say is one thing I'm sure of is that in people's reaction to being sent to those concentration camps, one of the reactions was not to treat those soldiers as human beings, or not to try and build resistance amongst those soldiers. And not that, it's not like the world is faced with a minimal number of concentration camps. The world is faced with them all over the world. And I think the only answer to that is a way of being which refuses the option of concentration camp. And if what you simply want to do, which if what you're doing is standing by the American state against the Russian state, is substitute American concentration camps for Russian concentration camps, then I'm afraid you offer no answer to the people of the world. The time's up, and we're going to have to split, so thank you very much.
The mime troupe will be over here on the grassy knoll.